Welcome to the webinar on housing insecurity that is presented as a part of Consumer Action's COVID-19 educational project with funding provided by AT&T. Thank you, AT&T. My name is Linda Williams. I am a Community Outreach and Training Manager with Consumer Action, and I would like to thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. I am so excited about the conversation we get to have today about housing insecurity. The COVID 19 pandemic has unleashed a health and economic crisis that highlights a pre existing condition in America: housing insecurity. Leading the discussion today on the pandemic and housing insecurity is Michaela Zonta from the Center for American Progress. Did you know that there's no standard definition for housing insecurity? No, there isn't. Think about it. Why? Because housing insecurity encompasses so many different challenges for our consumers. Joining us today is Tara Roach from Pew Charitable Trust. Tara will share with us Pew's research on one of these challenges: non-mortgage alternative financial arrangement. And she will share with us why these products can be risky for consumers. Also joining us is Sarah Bullen-Mancini. She is a staff attorney with the NCLC. She will share with us some strategies that can be used to assist consumers when dealing with these arrangements. Also, we are rolling out a new segment for our webinar. It's called "Is There Help on the Way?" Joining us is Carl Wyndham. He's a consultant from Freddie Mac, and Carl will discuss refinancing as an option for consumers who are not in default but could be stuck in those alternative financial arrangements or struggling with debt. Also joining us is Sarah Sadinian from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. She's going to tell us is there help on the way in the form of the Build Back Better Act that was recently passed by the House and on the way to the Senate. So get ready to be amazed, strap up, because we bringing the fire today. Now, before I get too excited, I need to go over some housekeeping. As the announcer stated, you are in listen only mode, but you can use the question function on the right of your screen to type in your questions. We love hearing from you. So at the end of all presentations, Outreach Trainer Nelson Santiago is going to facilitate an answers and questions segment. This is where we get to hear from you. So please take a minute, find that question function, and send Nelson a ton of questions. We need to keep him going today, okay? This is a 90-minute webinar, and it is being recorded. You receive a link to the recording, as well as all the PowerPoint slides used today with a few handouts no later than tomorrow afternoon. And this is really important, so please listen up. At the end of the training, you will receive a survey about today's webinar. We value your feedback as we work diligently to improve our service to you. So if you have a comment, a suggestion, or even a compliment, we would love to hear from you. So please complete the survey. And as always, as a bonus for attending today, you will receive a certificate of completion. Now, before I go any further, I need to update you with what's happening at Consumer Action. So what do we do at Consumer Action? Well, as it states on the screen, through education and advocacy, we fight for strong consumer rights and policies that promote fairness for all consumers, but especially for underrepresented communities nationwide. At Consumer Action, we're proud of all of our work, but we are especially proud of our COVID-19 educational project. So when you're on our website, find that little burgundy looking button in the middle, click on that link, and you will land on our COVID-19 project page. There you will find resources that you can share with your client communities that can help them navigate the COVID-19 financial crisis. For an example, we have fact sheets on identity theft, and account fraud during COVID, which is really important. They need to check them, make sure that they're not a victim because it can impact their credit. On fair housing rights, estate planning, financial help for undocumented workers, just to name a few. Check it out. Go to www.consumer-action.org/COVID-19 to learn more. Now, let me take a minute to review the agenda with you so you know where we are headed today. We at Consumer Action, we believe in making learning fun. So we open up each and every training by testing your knowledge on the topic of the training with our most popular game, How Much Do You Know? Today we have three true or false questions related to today's discussion. Following the game, I will introduce you to our guest professionals in the order they will be presenting. As I stated earlier, a question and answer segment led by Nelson Santiago will follow all presentations. I will come back, tell you how you can donate to CA, and wrap up. So, with that being said, let the game begin. Let's roll out the first question. So this is how the game is played. We have three questions. All are either true or false. I will read the question. You will use the poll function to answer each question. And at the end of the game, the person with the most correct answers, well, he or she get to walk away with the bragging rights. So how much do you know? So are you ready? Let's get with the first question. The economic recovery legislation that recently passed Congress, the Build Back Better Act, will fund as many as 300,000 new housing choice vouchers. Now, is that true or is that false? 300 new housing choice vouchers? Is that true or false? Don't overthink it. Don't overthink it. Go with your gut. Always go with your gut. Okay, let's close the poll and take a look at the results. 71% of you think that is true, that this act is going to bring as many as 300,000 new housing choice vouchers. 29% say it's false. 29%, you are incorrect. That is true. According to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, the economic recovery legislation that recently passed Congress, the Build Back Better Act, will fund a little more than 300,000 new housing choice vouchers to help people with low, very low income finally afford stable housing. We have Sarah from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I introduced you to her earlier. She will be along to tell us more about the Build Back Better Act and what it will mean if that legislation lands on Biden's desk. You're doing fantastic. Let's move on to the next question. Okay, so true or false? A common type of non-mortgage alternative financing is contract for deed, also known as land contracts or installment sale contracts. Is that true or false? What the heck is an installment contract? Sales contract. Sound like something you get at Macy's. So is that true or is that false? A common type of non-mortgage alternative financing is contract for deed, also known as a land contract or installment sale contract. Okay, let's close the polls and take a look at the results. 64% of you think that's true. 36% of you think it's false. Actually, that is true. Tara Roach from Pew will be here later on in the program, and she's going to talk to us about these alternative financial arrangements. So get your pen and paper out so you can take notes on what she's saying. Okay, thank you. So do we have another question? Great. So our next question is on refinancing. Refinancing benefits from homeowners include lower interest rates and reduced payments, making more money available to pay off debt or bill savings. So wait a minute. So if I refinance, I can get a lower interest rate, I have a reduced mortgage payment, and I have more money to pay off debt and build my retirement savings. Is that true or is that false? Don't overthink it. Go with your gut. Always go with your gut. Okay, let's close the polls and take a look at the results. Wow, 97% of you think that is correct, and only 3% think it's false. Well, actually, 3%, you're wrong today. That is correct. According to Freddie Mac, refinancing benefits for homeowners can include lowering the interest rate, freeing up money to pay off debt, reducing monthly mortgage payments to help build savings, even retirement savings, and shortening the term of the loan. You will hear more about refinancing from one of our guest speakers, Carl Wyndham. He will be on later on in the training. That's great. Thank you a lot for playing the game. I hope you've learned a little bit. Now, are you fired up and you ready for our featured presentations? Well, let me start by introducing you to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Michaela Zonta. She is a senior policy analyst for housing and consumer finance at American Progress. She has extensive research, teaching, and consulting experience in housing and community development. She has published work on mortgage lending practices of ethnic owned businesses in immigrant communities, job housing imbalance in minority community, and housing affordability. Prior to joining American Progress, Michaela taught urban and regional planning in the Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at Virginia Commonwealth University, where she delivered several graduate courses on housing policy, community development, British housing policy, and race and gender. Welcome to the webinar, Michaela. Now, here to discuss Pew's research on non-mortgage alternative financial arrangements is Tara Roach. Tara is a policy analyst at Pew Charitable Trust. She manages research for Pew's Consumer Finance Project, conducting original analysis of safety, affordability, and the availability of small mortgage and alternative financial arrangements used to purchase manufactured and other low-cost forms of housing. Tara previous work at Pew include research on everyday financial products, including small dollar loans, mobile payment, and student loans, to inform policy recommendations that protect consumers from harmful practices and promote safe, transparent credit. Welcome to the webinar, Tara. Now, Sarah Mancini will follow Tara. She's an attorney who specializes in housing issues and have had quite a few of these alternative financial arrangements come across her desk. Let me introduce you to Sarah. She is a staff attorney at the National Consumer Law Center, NCLC, focusing on foreclosure, mortgage lending, and credit reporting issues. Sarah previously worked in the home defense program of Atlantis Legal Aid and has represented homeowners in litigation in state, federal district, and bankruptcy court. She also clerked for the Honorable Amy Totenberg, U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. She received her BA in public policy from Princeton University and her JD from Harvard Law. Sarah, welcome back to Consumer Action. Now, we are opening up our Is There Help on the Way segment with Carl Wyndham, whose bios is so impressive. I can't get it all in today, so I'm just going to give you a few highlights. Carl Wyndham has over 27 years of regulatory experience working as an economic development specialist with the National Credit Union Administration. In this capacity, he routinely trained credit union industry, personnel, trade organization, and National Credit Union Administration employees on topics such as consumer compliance regulations, foreclosure prevention, financial education programs, accounting, auditing, management, balance sheet analysis, strategic planning, succession planning, marketing best practices, revenue and expense budgeting, partnership development, and collaboration. You get the picture? He is an accredited financial counselor and he is an accredited financial counselor and a financial coach and a consultant with Freddie Mac. Carl, welcome to the webinar. Also with us today is Sarah Fadian. She is Vice President of Public Policy at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Sarah oversees the National Low Income Housing Coalition Congressional Portfolio. She previously worked with Enterprise Community Partners as a senior analyst, where she focused on appropriations for federal housing and community development program, while a legislative and policy analyst at the National Consumer Reinvestment Coalition. Sarah's portfolio included expanded access to mortgage and small business credit. She graduated from the University of Connecticut School of Law after receiving her bachelor's degree from the University of Virginia. Welcome, Sarah. Now, in order for us to learn more about the pandemic's impact on housing insecurity, let me see if I can turn the webinar now over to Michaela. Michaela, you have control. You want to take it away?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Linda, for having me today. I'm excited to be part of this webinar and provide like an overview of housing insecurity during the pandemic and actually the roots of housing insecurity in the United States. The nation has a substantial housing instability that was present long before COVID-19, and the pandemic's economic toll has only made it worse. While employment is rising and puts significant pressures on household budgets, in recent months, the unemployment rate remains below pre-pandemic levels, and millions of families still report that their households are still struggling to meet their housing costs. Data from Census Bureau's Household Pulse survey, for example, show that a large portion of households, especially among renters, are not confident that they will be able to make next month's payment. Even before COVID, about 11 million households were spending more than half of their pre-tax income on housing, and overcrowding was on the rise. Because of a severe shortage of affordable housing, families in the lowest brackets of the income spectrum were severely burdened, as they spent more than 30% and even more than 50% of their income for housing costs. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic magnified housing insecurity, Black, Latino, and Native American renters faced disproportionately high rent burdens. These same groups often face systemic barriers when trying to access housing assistance programs. The economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic has only compounded these inequities. Renters of colors, for instance, face discrimination in obtaining and maintaining housing. Despite the Fair Housing Act, overt and subtle racial discrimination practices still occur. Renters of color are more cost-burdened, and cost-burdened renters, particularly those of color, are the most at risk of eviction due to the increased likelihood of missing rent payments. Also, the current housing stock does not fit the needs of multi-generational families of color, leading to overcrowding that, as we know, is a problem when it comes to a pandemic. Neighborhoods with more renters of color face higher rates of eviction. And due to historic and current policies, as well as systemic racism in housing, criminal justice, education, employment, and healthcare, people of color disproportionately experience homelessness. Homeowners and renters of color have consistently reported higher rates of rent hardship throughout 2020 and 2021. Census data from this past October indicated millions are having difficulty paying mortgage or rent. An estimated 12 million adults living in rental housing were not caught up on rent as of this past October. Here too, renters of colors were more likely to report that their household was not caught up on rent, like 20% of Black renters, 18% of Latino renters, and 20% of Asian renters said that they were not caught up on rent. The impact of the pandemic and economic fallout have been widespread, but remain particularly prevalent among Black adults, Latino adults, and other people of color. This disproportionate impact reflect long-standing inequities in education, employment, housing, and healthcare that the current crisis has just exacerbated. In particular, there is a long history of housing insecurity for people of color in the United States due to racially targeted policy and widespread discrimination. And we can actually have like an overview of the, of this history. We can take a look at what was happening before the Great Depression, when rapid population growth due to immigration led to a severe shortage of housing. Cities made no provision for housing the millions of newcomers who arrived in that period. And as native and foreign migrants streamed into the inner regions of Northern City, they pressed the private housing markets beyond their capacities. Housing was of low quality. There were low operating expenses, few services, and most of the rental income basically went to landlords. So, but these housing problems led to reforms like the tenement reform. So state and local governments enacted building, housing, and health codes. And also, social reformers believe that zoning offered a way not only to exclude incompatible uses from residential areas, but also to slow the spread of slums. Soon, however, what began as a means of improving the blighted physical conditions of these buildings became a mechanism for protecting property values and excluding people of color. The Depression years were very important in that we saw an increase in the role of government in housing construction. During the Depression years, unemployment rates skyrocketed. At the same time, the volume of new housing construction was reduced to almost nothing, while annual mortgage failures and the number of eviction notices served to many families tremendously increased. So housing became a concern of the Roosevelt administration, which opted for two distinct strategies. On one hand, it adopted an insurance program to stabilize financial conditions for homeownership and for mortgage lenders. On the other hand, the establishment of the Public Works Administration housing division programs sponsor construction and slum clearance projects to improve housing conditions for the poor and, most importantly, boost employment in the building industry. But these approaches had a very profound effect on segregation. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, for instance, institutionalized a rating system to evaluate the risk associated with loans made to specific neighborhoods. And the practices informed by such a rating system are commonly known as redlining, which 4 categories of neighborhood quality were established, and the lowest ones was generally coded with the color red. And this lowest category and the next one never received loans and were typically located in neighborhoods of color. Also, there was a deflection of investment money away from central cities, and the mortgage terms supported blue-collar and middle-class flight to the suburbs. And also, we have to remember that the early public housing program, which was designed to alleviate unemployment and remedy the unsafe and sanitary housing conditions for low-income families, left many without a decent housing. Going to the post-war years, well, during the war, the public housing program came to a halt and was reactivated by the 1949 Housing Act, despite many criticism. After the war, the demographic picture of the country began to shift. Some 5 million African Americans migrated from the South to the urban North and West. Large numbers of Southern Blacks also moved from the rural to the urban South. So housing demand skyrocketed. There was a severe housing congestion. And typically, as families doubled up in apartments and as single families residences were subdivided into multi-family units, overcrowded conditions worsened. Public houses was only a tiny portion of the government assistance to housing. The rating system that I described earlier, a significant influence on the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration loan programs during the 40s and 50s, which became available only to white home buyers. In the late 40s, the FHA recommended the use and application of racially restricted covenants as a means of ensuring the security of neighborhoods. And it did not change this recommendation until 1950, 2 years after the covenants had been outlawed. Mortgage interest deductions and FHA policies that denied credit to inner city neighbors spurred white flight. And also the 1949 Housing Act limited public housing to very low income people. Public housing projects were placed in less desirable neighborhoods, and their tenants generally reflected the racial composition of the surrounding area. As a result of these policies, the division between cities and suburbs assumed a racial dimension, with central cities becoming increasingly non-white and poor. Then the new urban renewal program entailed the raising of entire Black neighborhoods and also Hispanic neighborhoods in other communities of color, which threatened key white institutions and neighborhoods, and used federal funds to construct massive public housing projects in order to contain displaced Black residents. Now, all the policies that I just described are at the roots of the concentration of poverty that we see still around the country. But what happened since the post-war years? Well, several things happened. There has been a reduction in federally subsidized housing stock, and the inability of private housing market to produce and maintain affordable housing without public subsidy certainly put a lot of pressure, especially on low-income families. Housing affordability has been a common denominator along these past decades. Along with increases in housing cost, housing prices, energy costs. So the shortage of affordable units has severely impacted the ability of low-income families and families of color to, on one side, accumulate wealth that could be transmitted to the next generations, but also to meet like a daily needs. There has been an increase in homelessness, and certainly housing discrimination and residential segregation persist. The concentration of poverty and income inequality are topics that are constantly talked about. Of course, the recent foreclosure crisis has also exacerbated the conditions of several communities, so-called underwater communities, where subprime lending was very common. And then we go to the COVID-19 pandemic. So what can we do at this point? What can be learned from the history of housing insecurity in the United States? So now, with financial resources going to infrastructure and housing assistance, we can expect a housing recovery to happen at some point. However, it is important not to repeat the mistakes of the past. In particular, we have to pay attention to overcrowding. We have to pay attention to how we build housing. We don't want to reproduce the concentration of poverty. And we need to ensure fair housing for all, especially for the communities that have been marginalized over time. And I will be happy to take any questions.
Michaela, we're going to save the questions for the end. Thank you so much for that presentation. We're bringing the fire. Now let's move on and have a discussion about small mortgages and alternative financial arrangements used to purchase manufactured and other low-cost forms of housing. We're going to turn the webinar over to Tara Roach. I may take it away from Michaela and give it to Tara. There you go. Tara, you have control. Bring that fire.
Thank you, Linda. Thanks so much for having me on today and appreciate this wonderful introduction. So as Linda mentioned, I'm Tara Roach, Research Manager on the Home Financing Project at the Pew Charitable Trust. If you haven't heard of us before, we're a 501c3 nonprofit that studies a range of research and policy issues. The part of Pew that I sit in is the Housing, Labor, and Education Committee, where we look at a number of what I call family finance or kitchen table issues. And we launched a new project last year, the Home Financing Project, to study the lack of small mortgages around the country and the use of alternative financing on site-built and manufactured homes. So a bit about what I'll discuss today. So digging in a little more to the small mortgage hurdles, alternative financing definitions and challenges, manufactured housing financing and land ownership issues, because there are some unique hurdles that folks in manufactured homes face, and recent related policies, and of course, a little Q&A later. So how do people pay for their homes? Well, as most of you know, most people use a mortgage to finance that purchase, but there are millions of other families that have used something other than a mortgage to pay for the home, in part because it's increasingly difficult to find small mortgages for under $150,000. Larger mortgages are easier to get and they're more cost effective for lenders to issue, meaning that many creditworthy families are often left unable to buy homes. In recent years, there's been an increasing focus from a range of stakeholders, industry, nonprofits, academics, and others on the challenges that lenders and borrowers face when it comes to small mortgages. And also I'll note that the small mortgage definition varies a little bit. Some folks peg it at 70,000, others at 100 or 150. We look at the line being around 150 because from what we've heard in our in-depth interviews, looking at administrative data and other sources of information, we found that there's an observed decline in loans at this point, and usage of non-mortgage lending ticks up quite a bit at and around the $150,000 mark. Oops, excuse me. Sorry, popped up a couple slides there. There we go. So here's a good chart from the Wall Street Journal analyzing ATTOM data to show the decline in small mortgages under $150,000, those red and yellow lines there. And compared to the jump in larger mortgages above $150,000. An Urban Institute also conducted similar analyses and found that from 2009 to 2015, small mortgage production nationally decreased by 38%. And in contrast, there was a 65% jump in the origination of large mortgages above $150,000. And even after controlling for rising home prices, the number of small mortgages being used to purchase homes is still disproportionately lower than the number of low-cost homes that are being sold. And our current research looking at a snapshot of the small mortgage market in 2020 finds that this trend persists despite an uptick in mortgage originations and a growing demand for loans to purchase low-cost homes. Small mortgages are also denied more often. Urban Institute again did a nice analysis looking at the small mortgage decline and found that creditworthiness was not a driver, so we need to better understand what those challenges are in this space and why that's happening. So let me talk a little bit about what we're seeing with respect to hurdles issuing small mortgages. So through our research, we've identified a number of problems that basically fall into two buckets. They're either structural or regulatory, and when combined, they affect the incentives to originate more small mortgages. So under structural hurdles, the cost of originating has become a common recurring theme. Fixed costs, as I mentioned before, to originate a small mortgage, well, they're similar to the cost to originate a higher balance loan. And these costs are significantly higher as a share of the loan principal for small mortgages, so it does become economically challenging for both a lender and a borrower. Loan officer compensation is also another issue that's often cited. A cap on compensation combined with a commission-based compensation can make it more viable to focus on those higher balance loans rather than lower balance under $150,000 mortgages. But even if lenders could overcome these challenges with costs and compensation, aging inventory can also play a role here, as many homes can be in need of repair. And we don't know a lot about the efficacy of all the existing programs that can help with rehabbing homes, home repair programs. And of course, we have a shortage of new homes being built in the country, as was mentioned before. Regulatory barriers are a bit more complex. On the one hand, existing mortgage rules have been cited as sometimes exacerbating or feeding some of these structural issues. However, they are an important component of managing risk and ensuring consumer protections. So the real issue seems to be balancing both these interests in a way that promotes more small mortgage production. Let's talk a bit about what alternative home financing is. So as Linda mentioned in the little quiz earlier, land contracts and contracts for deed, also lease purchase and rent to own arrangements, seller financed mortgages, and personal property home only or chattel loans, as they're sometimes called, that are specifically for manufactured homes. So we know that some folks do, when they can't get a mortgage, continue to rent, but many others use these other kinds of arrangements. And we'll talk a bit more about some of the challenges there and the laws that govern them. So I want to talk structurally about what these look like. So this is a pretty simple view of a mortgage process compared to a land contract. But I like to really use this as an illustrative example for the difference in ownership. So in a mortgage, we have, typically a buyer and a seller. The note or contract and down payment and regular payments would move to a third party, the bank, escrow company, title company, etc. Proceeds from the sale are then sent to the seller, and the house and title or deed go to the buyer. However, in this example with a land contract, still have our buyer and seller, of course. Buyer gets the house that they will live in. Their down payment, if there is one, and regular payments are sent to the seller directly, no third party there, usually. However, the note or contract and title or deed are also retained with the seller. So big difference here is, A, there's not always that third party, but really that title or deed demonstrates ownership, and it becomes really legally ambiguous if that is retained by the seller when the buyer is living in the home. There were a few land contract sellers that we've talked throughout our research that do like to use an escrow company to make sure that incentives are aligned and that the buyer is submitting payments, that they don't have to track it. And in those situations, it can become a little clearer where responsibilities fall, but that doesn't seem to be the standard across the country. So where is alternative home financing? Well, it's everywhere. It's widespread. Lease purchase and seller finance mortgages are available in many states. Land contracts are more common in certain regions, in the Midwest and the Southeast and Texas. This could be driven by the fact that there are recording requirements, so those have to be documented the way a mortgage would, but that doesn't mean that's necessarily the cause. It could just be there's something related about the reasons why those are being recorded and also why they exist in those states. But this could be part of that explanation why we're seeing more prevalence in those regions. And personal property loans for manufactured homes are widespread, but are concentrated in the Sun Belt, so in the southern part of the US there. We commissioned a state law scan with NCLC that we learned a lot from, and you'll hear a bit more from Sarah after me from NCLC. And I want to overview this really quickly because we learned so much from this study. So contracts are governed at the state and local level through statutes, ordinances, and major legal decisions or case law. In some of these arrangements, people are treated as mortgage owners. Sometimes these are considered rental agreements, so they're tenants. Very few states have lease option laws. About half of states have substantive laws on land contracts, and in research and in law, this seems to be the kind of arrangement that has received the most study and interest. Even when we look at current legislation, most of the activity is on land contracts. And as I mentioned before, responsibilities for upkeep and consumer protections are often unclear because of that legal ambiguity when it comes to who is owning or retaining the title or the deed. And that can create a host of issues. So we categorize risks for alternative financing into a few buckets. And again, this won't be everywhere for everything, but it is what we hear about the most. And it does seem to be prevalent across many of the states where these exist. So for the buyer, again, unclear ownership, lack of equity or inability to borrow against their home, eviction or foreclosure issues. They're often ineligible for federal and state assistance, which I'll talk a little bit more about later in relation to the pandemic. For the seller, it's usually pretty minimal. In the event of non-payment, they can often evict the buyer or tenant, again, depending on how the state treats that. It's also possible that the home value might decline if a home goes under judicial sale. But again, because of their ability to foreclose or evict on someone, because there are not foreclosure protections the way there are for mortgages, risks for seller here are much smaller compared to the risks for the buyer. And lastly, responsibility for taxes and maintenance can be uncertain for state and local governments. That unclear ownership can lead to dilapidated homes, low home values, and similar for buyers, it can be hard to target those resources and access them for the residents in your jurisdiction, particularly during a recession or a pandemic. There's also really unique risks for folks in manufactured homes. So I want to talk about them for a second. So when we discuss manufactured housing, we're talking about homes built after 1976, unsubsidized manufactured homes. They are conform to HUD codes. They're often indistinguishable. Today's models are often indistinguishable from site-built homes. And there's research to show they can appreciate similarly to site-built homes when they're placed on owned land. Manufactured housing exists all around the country, but as you can see from this map created by the Housing Assistance Council, the dark blue areas are where 30 to 54% of existing homes are manufactured. So the stock is more likely to be manufactured housing in those areas. And while a larger proportion of the housing stock in rural America is manufactured housing, about half of the stock of all manufactured housing is located in metropolitan areas. As I mentioned earlier, manufactured home residents face unique challenges. For example, when a person buys a site-built home, it's built as a fixture on the land and always owned as real property or real estate. Manufactured housing is different. So when the person goes to a dealership to purchase the home, it's usually considered personal property at the time of sale, just like a car. Now they can put that on owned land. Over 60% of families in manufactured housing do this and keep it as either personal property, or they can retitle it as real estate. And this decision to retitle is very important because only real estate is eligible for a mortgage. Personal property is not eligible for a mortgage. So you can put that home on family land or rented land, and then it can only remain as personal property if it's on rented land. And some people put their homes in communities, again, where those lands would be rented. There are models around the country that are cooperative, and there are organizations that do help folks purchase those homes, but they're a less common arrangement. And the way that land is owned plays an important part in the financing available, the cost of that financing, and consumer protections, especially in default. And the kinds of financing that's available varies by state, race, and ethnicity. So this is a snapshot from the CFPB's most recent report on manufactured housing. The size of the pie charts here indicates how many loans were made in each state in 2019. The blue shares of each pie chart are manufactured home mortgages, and the orange are chattel or personal property loans. So you can see there's a lot of variability depending on the state. It's not clear yet what's driving this. It might have to do with titling laws, land ownership, or owner preference, or something else. But what we do know is that Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous populations are more likely to use expensive personal property loans compared to mortgages. We also know that personal property loan borrowers have financial profiles that are just as strong as manufactured housing mortgage borrowers. So again, need to understand a bit more about what's going on with that disproportionate access to personal property versus mortgages. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the state and federal guidance, legislation, and policy. So during the pandemic on manufactured housing, some states introduced legislation to assist the residents in their state. So for example, California had a bill to include manufactured homeowners. A lot of the bills that have been introduced over this past year and a half typically look at preserving communities as affordable housing, titling reform, so on and so forth, anything around protections, allowing more manufactured housing. In this past year, 10 states have introduced 26 bills, so a fairly active topic for states to be getting involved in, and increasingly we're seeing more housing-related bills. On alternative financing, in the pandemic, Minnesota, as an example, put forth bills to include land contract homeowners in the assistance they were planning to offer their residents, but like California, these bills didn't pass. And bills that are introduced often include things like recording requirements and certain consumer protection elements. In this past year, a little less activity, but we again are increasingly seeing states introduce bills focused on alternative financing, by and large on land contracts. And so far, 6 states have introduced a dozen bills on alternative financing this year. Also going to mention a couple things about federal policy and guidance. So our home financing project right now is in a research-only phase, so we don't have policy recommendations, but our work is meant to inform policy, and so we closely follow relevant policy law and guidance going on. I won't detail all of these, I'll just briefly note a couple, but there is one I would like to dig into. So duty to serve regulations for Fannie and Freddie, our focus there is really on what they're doing in the manufactured housing space to expand liquidity and lending. There's also been a couple of bills focused on housing, manufactured housing tenants and communities, so protections for those residents. We're also watching the FHFA loan limit increases to see if there will be an impact on small mortgages there. I want to talk for a second about this last bullet, Treasury Homeowner Assistance Fund. The Treasury recently put forth requirements for this fund, asking for proposals from states and jurisdictions to submit plans. And interestingly, in this guidance, Treasury included land contract homeowners and those with loans on their manufactured homes in their definition of homeowner. And this is a pretty unusual move, as these folks are often excluded from assistance that focuses on renters and mortgage holders. So that was really great to see, and we're closely watching what states are doing as they submit their plans. So far, we've reviewed about 3 dozen plans and found that 21 states included both groups, so those with land contracts and those with loans on their manufactured homes. And more than half have included at least one of these groups. So a few key takeaways before I wrap up. Low-cost homes are available, but it's difficult for credit-worthy borrowers to obtain small mortgages. Millions of people instead have used non-mortgage alternative financing. They're more prevalent in Hispanic, Black, and Indigenous communities, and these arrangements are often riskier than mortgages, and protections vary widely across states. Federal and state assistance often excludes people who use alternative financing, but increasingly there have been some recent policies that do include these borrowers and homeowners. And manufactured housing is the most common type of unsubsidized affordable housing, but zoning, titling, and financing challenges can undermine its effectiveness. So we have some upcoming research that we'll be sharing out in the next several weeks to months. Deeper explorations of the barriers to small mortgage origination, a national survey of non-mortgage alternative financing borrowers to discuss their experiences and outcomes, an analysis of the alternative financing laws that includes the wonderful work that NCLC did, an analysis of manufactured housing financing. Oh, sorry, I'm getting quick with the mouse here. And lastly, some qualitative work. So we've been doing in-depth interviews across the country with legal aid experts. So to date, we have over 40 interviews across about half the states in the country. And we'd really love to continue fleshing this out and talking with legal aid experts, attorneys, housing counselors, and others who've worked with homeowners and residents that use these kinds of arrangements. It's been a really rich experience talking with these folks and understanding the challenges that these borrowers face. So my contact information is here at the end. And again, happy to chat more in Q&A, but if folks are up for chatting with us, please do reach out. We'd really welcome the opportunity to speak more with you about these issues. And thank you, Linda. Back to you.
Thank you. Now let's turn it over to Sarah Mancini so we can discuss strategies for dealing with these products. Sarah, you should have control.
Thanks so much, Linda. Okay, all right, and good to be with you all today. Really, thank you for inviting me to join. And NCLC has been working closely with Pew on these issues, as Tara mentioned. So my piece of the puzzle today is to talk a little bit about practical strategies for dealing with these alternative home financing schemes if you come across an individual who is currently in one. We realize that the audience today includes a lot of different advocates, including legal services attorneys, housing counselors, and other advocates in a variety of settings. And so we just wanted to give you a quick overview of the strategies that can work to help these individuals maintain stable housing or get out of a bad situation. So first of all, if you're trying to advise somebody that is in a strange or alternative home purchase arrangement, the first step in that process is to figure out what type of contract they're dealing with. And as Tara described, I would say there's two major kinds, and that's excluding the seller financed mortgages, which Tara also mentioned. It could be that the person you're talking with has a mortgage loan and a deed, but the person that sold them the home is also the creditor. So I'm putting that to one side. But these other two kinds are really are in some ways the most prevalent, and those are the land installment contract or land contract or contract for deed. And the other one is the lease with option to buy or lease purchase. And so just to distinguish them, and I know Tara described this, I'm just going to kind of recap it. A contract for deed or land contract is a situation where the buyer is promising to pay a fixed amount of money at a certain interest rate over a certain period of time, and they're making their payments to the seller. But the seller does not give that person the deed until all payments are made. So the seller holds on to the deed as essentially security for the payment of this debt. And I think Tara explained that well. And that's the fundamental feature of these contracts. And just to visualize this comparison, and I know Tara also showed this, this is just another way of visualizing it. If you buy a house with a regular mortgage, then on day one, the home buyer gets the deed, which is the legal ownership of the house in their name, and they also sign a mortgage that grants a security interest in the house to their lender. But they get that deed, that full legal ownership on day one. Whereas with the contract for deed, they sign the contract on day one, and they don't get the deed until some point down the line, whenever they've paid the full purchase price, which might be 30 years down the road, or it could be shorter. Sometimes they're 10 years, 20 years, any length of time until the full balance has been paid. And if someone misses a single payment at any point in this time period, they can lose everything they have invested in the home. And that is the fundamental unfairness of these contract for deed transactions, is that the person believes they are becoming a homeowner and they take on all the obligations of home ownership without the legal rights of a homeowner. And so if you're in a contract for deed, in most states, the seller can, if you miss a single payment, just say your contract is canceled and we are evicting you like a tenant. And even if you have made $10,000 in home repairs and you've been paying the property taxes and you've made a large down payment, you lose all of it typically. Now with a lease purchase or lease with option to buy, it's really two contracts. It's actually a residential lease and also an option contract that gives this home buyer or tenant the right to buy the home at a later date for a certain agreed upon price within a certain time period, usually 6 months to 2 years. And so the visualization, how is the contract for deed different from a lease option? We already explained the contract for deed, but with a lease option, the buyer or tenant signs the lease and the option contract on day one, And at some point along the line, they're supposed to exercise that option. And at that moment, they get the deed and a mortgage. So it is legally different from the contract for deed or land contract. So it's important to try to identify which of those types of contracts you're dealing with. The person is, if someone is coming and looking for help. But I will say many of these contracts blur the line between the two, and that is intentional, because in some states where there are statutes or case law protecting people who are in a contract for deed or land contract, the sellers, the investors have gotten wise, and they've started to put at the top of the document, lease with option to buy. Even if the contract is fundamentally the same, they're trying to call it a lease with option to buy because they're trying to make the buyer, not know that they have certain protections. So be aware that the title of the document is not dispositive. You have to look at the substance of the document. And really, it is important to refer someone to an attorney to help them navigate this process. Really an attorney is in the state is the best position to help you figure out which type of contract it is. But the second point that I think anyone can help with, any type of advocate, is to help the consumer figure out what is their goal. They've come to you for help, they're in a bad situation, maybe they're behind on payments, or maybe they're just wondering, I don't understand what my rights are. You got to try to identify what their goals are. And part of that is figuring out, is this a house that this person really wants to buy? Is it a good deal for them? And the key questions there are, what is the purchase price that's been agreed to, and how much is the home worth? Though that's really the most important part, because so often in these contracts, either flavor of contract, the price that's put in the document is grossly inflated over the fair market value because there's no appraisal being done and there's no inspection being done. So oftentimes the person has a contract to buy a home for, say, $100,000, and you look on Zillow and it's really worth like $45,000. And so I recommend helping the consumer research the value of the home they're trying to buy. Look at Zillow, ePraisal.com, other websites that are online valuations. Those are a good source of information because they pull from recent comparable sales. And then also the county tax assessor can give you an idea. And that, those values are sometimes a little bit off, but it's worth it to pull a couple different values or even talk to a real estate agent. But figure out, have they agreed to pay a price that is grossly inflated? And if so, they probably don't want to go forward with purchasing that house at that price. And the question will be, do they have any leverage to get the price reduced? But if not, their best option may be to try to walk away, maybe to try to get some of their money back. But you have to figure out, are they trying to stay in this home and buy it, or is it better for them to get out? And so another big question there is, what is the condition of the home? Is it safe? Is there functioning, plumbing, electricity? Are there major conditions problems? And if the person can't afford to fix those, then they're probably better off letting go of this house. And then the other question is, are there other liens on the house? Does the seller actually even have good title to the home? Because typically with these transactions, there's no title search. There's no lawyer doing a deed search at the outset. So oftentimes there's some other mortgage on the property, or there are back taxes owed. And so ideally the consumer needs to try to research those issues too, to figure out if they try to stay in this transaction, are they actually going to get good title, or are they going to lose the home to a property tax foreclosure, or is there some other mortgage company that hasn't been paid off that could foreclose at any point in time? So I will say that there are a number of potential legal claims in these transactions, and if the consumer can get to a lawyer, and usually it's legal services attorneys that handle these cases, but private attorneys might also do it, they can use these legal claims to create leverage to either get some of their money back and move, or get the contract reformed into a better, more fair transaction. So what are those arguments? I'm going to try to go through these pretty quickly because I know we have a lot more to cover. One argument is to say that this contract is really an equitable mortgage. And there are some states where there's a statute that says that you have to treat it like a mortgage loan and do a foreclosure. The question is there any limitation on the seller's right to kick you out like a tenant Is there any either statute or case law in your state that says, no, actually a consumer in this type of contract has the right to be treated like an owner and have an actual foreclosure carried out, which is better because it gives them more protections and more opportunities to stop that train from leaving the station. So this is a state law question. You really have to talk with an attorney in your state. Another legal claim that could apply is the Truth in Lending Act. If it is a contract for deed or land contract, this is a loan. It is an extension of credit, and it is covered by the Truth in Lending Act if the seller creditor has originated a certain number of these transactions in a calendar year. And so that's a question, whether they're covered based on the numerical threshold. But in general, these transactions are covered by the Truth in Lending Act, and most sellers assume that they are not covered, so they don't comply. So there's often truth in lending violations. They haven't disclosed the cost of credit under TILA, and they haven't complied with the substantive rules about verifying ability to pay. In some instances, they might be required to do an appraisal if it's a higher priced loan, and they usually don't comply. Other types of claims are UDAP, what we call UDAP, unfair and deceptive acts and practices. The fundamental feature of these transactions is they are giving people a false promise of home ownership. They are telling you, you are becoming a homeowner, you own this house. But in reality, you don't own this house, you don't have a deed, and you're often making enormous expenditures for repairs on a home you actually don't own. So many people have had success under your state unfair and deceptive practices laws, seeking damages for that. Another big one is fair housing laws. In the work that NCLC does, we have found that these products disparately impact people of color. And so we have brought claims under the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and the companion state and local laws. And this is just an example from a case we had in Georgia against Harbor Portfolios. It's a map of the location of their transactions overlaid with racial demographics. And as you can see, they were almost entirely in the census tracts that were 80 to 100% African American. These unfair products are not being equally spread among the population. They are disparately targeted at borrowers of color. So it is a racial justice issue, and we need to be thinking about fair housing claims. And there was a great piece done in the Atlantic on the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, but called A House You Can Buy But Never Own. And this person, Zachary Anderson, was one of the plaintiffs in our Harbor Portfolio lawsuit. And through that lawsuit, we were able to keep him in his home and get him a deed and get him full ownership. But I just wanted to show you this picture because he was such a courageous individual, and these fair housing lawsuits are very important for these problems. There are some other legal claims, but I think I need to wrap up to keep us on time. But just be aware that other issues like unlicensed lending, fraud, and usury might apply. And then finally, with the lease with option to buy, it can be a little bit harder to deal with if it is a true lease with option. Again, keep in mind, sometimes it's a fake lease with option that's really a land contract in disguise. So you've got to look beneath the surface. But if it's a true lease option, unfortunately, buyers, these are usually not a good idea for people. Usually they pay a large option fee that is maybe $3,000 or $5,000 or even more, often using their tax refund because these are low-income people. So this could be a big thing coming up in the beginning of the new year when people get their tax refunds. And that is described as a non-refundable option fee. But what you're getting for that is the right to buy a house for a certain price that, again, may be totally inflated because there's no inspection, no appraisal, and again, the seller might not even have good title. So often people pay an option fee for an option that is worthless. And so you've got to, again, think about what is the strategy, and do you want to describe this as a lease? Because oftentimes they say in the lease with option to buy that the tenant has to make repairs, but that is illegal in 48 states. Everywhere except for Michigan and I think it's Alabama, it's either Alabama or Arkansas. There are only 2 states in the country that allow landlords to put the duty of repairs onto a tenant under certain circumstances. Everywhere else in the country, the landlord has the duty to make repairs. So if a lease option puts that duty on the tenant, that is an unfair and deceptive practice in most places. And then there might be arguments that there's a contract failure if they've paid money for an option that's really worthless. In the slides, we've given you references to a number of lawsuits. So those are just resources for you to be aware of. And then the final thing I wanted to mention on a slightly different topic is During the pandemic, many homeowners are struggling to pay their mortgages. At NCLC, we do a lot of work on this issue. There are forbearance options available, and then for people who are exiting their forbearance window, which is a lot of people right now, the end of this year and the beginning of next year, many people are getting out of their forbearance and they need either a deferral or a loan modification. There are also these homeowner assistance fund programs that are coming online in every state, but they're not available yet, but they're coming soon. So please be aware that there is help available. People need to be aware of scams and make sure not to pay money to a scammer. And if you're trying to help someone, the key question is it an FHA loan, VA or USDA, or is it owned by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac? Because figuring that out allows you to know what options are available. And those are just some consumer resources from the CFPB. They have this wonderful housing assistance portal that is for both owners and renters to help them avoid foreclosure and eviction. And then I've also given the link to NCLC's project. And I'm going to stop there and stick around for questions.
Thank you, Sarah. We're bringing a fire today, so let me turn it over to Mr. Carl Wyndham. You have control. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And good afternoon to the entire audience. So real quickly, I'm going to talk about home refinancing and what you need to know to close the wealth gap. So today, basically the overall objectives, because we're short on time, and long story short, this is to actually take one mortgage and turn it into another mortgage. And so understanding the basics of how you do that is really important. Understand the time to do that is important. Understanding the resources to do that is important. And so that's basically what this slide and what the overall objectives of this conversation is all about. If we look at the homeownership rate on average, it's about 65% in the nation as of October of 2021. The previous speakers talked about the obstacles and the barriers to getting into home ownership. And so I'd love to say to the people that's on the line who own a home, congratulations. And for those who are trying to obtain a home or get a mortgage or a standard mortgage, you may have your work cut out for you moving forward. But what we're trying to do is use the home as a way to build wealth. And so in African American communities, the homeownership rate tends to be immigrant communities and communities of color in general. Ownership rate tends to be less than the national averages, as you can see here by this map. And so even if you looked at California's 36%, look at where I live in Georgia is 47%, and you'll notice that the browner the color in the map, the higher the level of ownership, albeit in California, home ownership rate of 36% is still impressive because of the price of the houses alone. And so we have a disproportion there. We also have a disproportion in terms of how we see the wealth gap. There's income inequality, wealth inequality, and what we call inequitable equity. And really what that means is that income inequality is the wages are lower than the average, or the amount of money that we have in the bank is less than. For instance, if the average person that has wealth has $117,000 in the bank, and we only have, as a community, for instance, have $17,000, there's a 10 times gap there. And so that's what creates the wealth gap. And then there's other factors as well. In terms of inequitable equity, it's really all about how houses are appraised in African American communities and communities of color. I think the last map that they showed the overlay of how manufactured housing and how housing is distributed, I think you could actually put that across the country. And what we have, ladies and gentlemen, is not only a wealth gap of inequality, but we also have an information gap. As the last three speakers were speaking, I was just thinking of over all the years I've been in this business, how complex the system has become more of. So not only did we face redlining, and not only did we face all these obstacles, and now we got all these other legalities in terms of people having homes. And so as a homeowner, as a consumer, I'm almost sure that there's a lot of confusion out there. And so what we like to do is try to break down how to really significantly improve the lot here. And so one of the things is, one way you close the wealth gap is you just understand what the fundamentals are in finance in general. And so one of the things that, informationally speaking, we hear a lot of this from a whole lot of speakers who say about financial literacy and so forth. But I could tell you, in counseling thousands of clients over the years, really, it's not a matter of some time of what you don't have. It's a matter of what you do know or don't know. And so when we talk about closing the wealth gap, what you need to know is that how you handle your money is really important. Now, I realize that some people have no money and some people have more money than others. So we want to talk about this from the perspective of where your wallet is right now. And so if you're trying to get more money, you want to try to improve your financial behavior. And so one thing about it is saving, and delay instant gratification, and understand what your financial goals are, and everybody should have them. And most of all, if you can do this, stay away from debt, live below your means if at all possible, although that's not necessarily possible if people are not making a living wage and living in a high cost state, as they talked about being house burden, rent burden, and how this affects communities of color, because it's the opposite way. Either you're going to owe people money or you're going to be putting more money back in your pocket. And one way you do close the wealth gap is that you don't pay all the money that you earn out. And so seeking multiple streams of income, investing, and invest in yourself in terms of education and knowledge. Because one of the biggest gaps in the country, for instance, I grew up in Harlem, New York, and I didn't know a whole lot of this stuff when I was a little guy just standing on the corner. And as I grew up and learned and went to school and so forth, and served with the government for 27 years, I've learned a whole lot. And what I've learned also is there's a information gap in our community as well. So invest in yourself to learn more about what you should know. Also, make the most of your money all the time. Spend your money smart and just do all of the things you need to do, but specifically know your numbers and utilize financial professionals, housing counselors, advocates, lawyers. All of the things that people stated earlier are in vogue or in play for all consumers and all people. If you're a counselor, you definitely want to be referring these resources to people in terms of what their needs are and whatever their situation may be. And so, as we talk about refinancing, the real scope here is to understand how to take advantage of being in a situation where you may have a high cost mortgage because for whatever reason, and knowing how to get it down. So, this reduces your debt, it shortens your terms. It lowers your interest rates, which saves you money over time. And then it allows you to get a more affordable mortgage, like instead of maybe of a variable, you might want to get a fixed mortgage and so forth. And you may actually have a home that's increased in value over the term of the pandemic, where housing prices have risen roughly around 17%, 12 to 17%, depending upon where you live. And so you may want to do cash out refinancing and so forth. But the idea here, ladies and gentlemen, is to understand the reason why you want to take one mortgage and swap it for the others. And so that might be reasons to refinance your home. Okay, I can't move the slide. Okay. Okay, here we go. So 11 million more homeowners can cut their mortgage payments. And I think this is important because the money that you could save by cutting your mortgage payments can be utilized in your budget for other activities. To build wealth and so forth. But the real thing here is understanding that the interest rate environment that exists now is the lowest rate environment in the history of mortgages. But at the same time, we need to understand as a community how to take advantage and understand the benefits and the time to actually make smart money moves. You hear the term money moves and strategy, and everybody making different types of maneuvers in the marketplace. But the truth of the matter is, understanding when to make the move is really important to closing the wealth gap. Because if you have an opportunity to save money, and if you have an opportunity to save money and invest it back in your family and your future and your home even, I think you should take advantage of that. So almost 50% of all Black borrowers could save as much as $1,200 by refinancing or more. So is the time now? I'd say absolutely. The time would be now, because really the rates are the cheapest they ever been in history. And so what that means is, if you look at this chart right here, is that the fixed rate mortgages for the last 30 years is roughly around 3%. Yes, they're going up, but still, it's still the greatest time in history, because in the history of the country, we've never had an interest rate environment that's so low. So if you're trying to get out of an alternative mortgage and go into a mainstream mortgage, now would be the time. Or if you're in a mortgage where you can lower the interest rate no matter where you are, you want to look to see if that would work for you. And so this is the opportunity. But the question always is, are you in the right position to get this done and take advantage of this opportunity as it presently stands? And so there's a reason why a lot of people are not doing this, and that is because they were thinking about moving, or they were thinking about how much it would really cost them in terms of higher fees. And if you have alternative mortgages, you're already paying higher fees, or you did pay higher fees. And so one way to help reduce your costs long term in terms of a higher interest rate and so forth is to lower the interest rate, lower the term, own your home sooner, own things faster. And that's one way to close the wealth gap. But 29% of all people say it's because they really don't understand the process. And after listening to the three speakers prior to myself, I can see why. Because this is a real daunting type of system that we live in the financial system. So it could be very complex, as I stated earlier. And so it's really tragic that people don't understand this opportunity, because if I could save from $300 to $500 on an obligation I already have and put money back in my pocket, I can use it for other things, like to reduce debt, or increase my savings account, or save for retirement and maybe kids' college. And if I have money left over, maybe do some investing. And so in refinancing, you need to really think about it in 5 different pillars, or 5 different boxes, if you will. And so you have the decision, you have what the costs are going to be, your personal financial situation, what lender you use, and what product you use with that particular lender. And so how do you make a decision? Which way do you go? And so it's a good time to make a decision. The basic thing about all financial decisions: when is a good time, when is not a good time to make a financial decision. So right now, for instance, interest rates are at historic lows. It's a great time. Save you money. Great time. It can reduce the term of the mortgage. Okay. It can lower your monthly payment. And finally, if it's a great business decision, you got to understand the benefits versus the cost. And so, should you refinance your mortgage now? Look at the factors at play. If you can do it by 0.5% to 0.75% or more, yes, it's a go. If you can reduce your cost, yes, it's a go. If you can reduce your cost in terms of the fees you pay out, and you stay in the home over a 3-year period, yes, your break-even period, you can reduce costs. It's a go. And finally, if it fits your financial goals, you definitely want to do this, because it's a go. So we have almost like a stop sign, red, amber, and then green. And so when you really look at this, if you fulfill all of these factors, now would be a great time to do that. And so when is it a good time to hold off? So when is a good time not to do this? Well, for all these reasons here, but for the most part, if you have a lot of falling home prices and no equity, you really clearly, every single time you make a financial transaction, you should be working from a financial plan. If there's any one thing I can impart to everyone here on this call, whether you're professional or non-professional, and that is always have a plan, a financial plan, and work from the perspective of what it is you're trying to accomplish. And so you really just want to know that, because you really want to have clear financial goals, because remember, your home is your largest asset. You don't want to lose it to foreclosure. You don't want to not be able to pay your mortgage. And they talked about rent insecurity and housing insecurity and being rent burden, but there's also mortgage burden too. You can live in a house where the mortgage is more than half of what you make, for instance. And so it's not a good idea to ever do anything if you don't understand the process. So if you have these red light signals, or red flags, if you will, come to pay, you don't want to refinance at all. So just ask yourself all these questions. Will it improve my financial security, my financial well-being? Does it align with my goals? Is it the right thing to do? And so on. And will it reflect positively? And so anytime that you can make a financial transaction and it puts money back in your pocket, saves you money, saves you time, allows you to obtain an asset sooner than later, absolutely, because everyone wants to own their home. And when you own a home, that's really part of what we're trying to achieve in the American dream, because then you have legacy wealth that you can pass on to the next generation. And in order to do that, you just really got to have what we call SMART goals in the business. Um, and all these things you need to know, just where you want to go, where are you now, and how you're going to get there, and understand how to deal with this financial issue in terms of what you need versus what you want and what you can afford. But make sure you always do the research and then get the mortgage of your dreams. Also, look at how much it costs you. They had mentioned the disclosures. Always look at what they call the APR, or the annual percentage rate, versus the stated rate, because that's how they do the bait and switch in mortgages. Because you might see a sign on the corner as you pass that say mortgages as low as 2.5%. But by the time you finish, if you look at the document, it's saying that the mortgage rate you're paying is 5 to 7%. Why? Because they've stacked on fees that you don't see, and that's hidden right there in front of you in plain sight. But if you're not knowledgeable, or you know that, then you won't be able to take advantage of that situation. Some of it is scams, but also just always look at the fee structure. Look at the cost versus the benefit of staying in a home. So, for instance, if you spend $1,800 and it saves you $100 a month, it only takes you 18 months to recover your costs, and you're going to stay there over 3 years. It's a great decision. Always look at this point of view, and you'll have these slides, so you can always use this formula to make that decision with. And you can also use calculators. I'm an advocate of not only understanding and reading, but seeing is believing also. And it's called show and tell. I'm thinking one thing, my mortgage is going to be this. I'm going to save $559 a month on a mortgage I currently have. So I'm thinking about refinancing. And so at the end of the day, I see here where my current loan is $1,500 a month, and now by refinancing, I'm down to 980, which is the savings. And then if you look at the total interest saved over time, there you have it. But if you instill these numbers into a calculator, it would allow you to see it. And so if you use the Freddie Mac Home Counselor calculators, that would be great. Um, Look at your personal financial situation. And so we talked about the biggest obstacle, complexity of the system, process, decision framework, really lack of knowledge, and then also your own personal history in terms of your economic outlook, poor credit, low credit score, high debt to income, loss of income, and so forth. And trying to obtain a home under those factors is really very difficult. And then what are your goals and what's happening in your real estate market? And so lenders use credit, capacity, and collateral as factors to qualify you for a mortgage. So your home has to have a certain worth. You have to have a certain history and credit score, and so forth. You have to have the ability to pay the mortgage, and you have to have money set aside for the down payment. And so as you do this, as you prepare for mortgage refinancing, just look at your situation, know the value of your home, understand the rates and the terms of refinancing, understand your purpose, understand the price, and finally, once you can do all that, close your loan. So how much equity do you need? At least 20% down in terms of you, the borrower. The lender looks at loan to value, 80-20. So it's the flip side of what you have. You have 20% equity. They have 80% of the loan covered by the equity. And so how much rate or how low the rate you can get is based on your credit history, credit score, the amount you owe, the value of the home, closing costs, and the policies of the lender. And so if there's any one takeaway I could tell you, coming from a regulatory perspective as a financial regulator, is always look at individual institutions' policies and rates. And as you shop around, make sure you look at the different rates, terms, and conditions. For instance, what type of mortgage, what are the terms, and what are the rate structures like? A lot of people got caught up in what they call the hybrid rates, and it'll last for a certain period of time, and then it'll convert to another rate. All of these create greater complexities for the consumer, but you as a consumer just need to know that information. Choosing the right lender is really critical here. And that could be, you want to use at least 3 lenders before you start this process, and at least 5 lenders, according to Freddie Mac. You're going to save more money if you shop around. And so it's all about who has the best terms and conditions for you. Here's the bottom line. At the end of the day, whatever mortgage you're in or whatever mortgage you're seeking, what you're trying to do is maximize, optimize the mortgage, the rates, the terms and conditions that fits your lifestyle, that allows you not to pay so much more than other people. And so just finding equity in shopping and understanding the rates, terms, and conditions is very important. Understanding the different types of institutions are important. I understand they talked about alternative mortgages, and that is a market for people who a lot of times don't have the standardized credit ratings, who want to get homes faster and so forth. I'm not judging. What I'm saying is, if you have an opportunity to buy a home, by all means, check it out. But also look at the rates, terms, and conditions and the type of institution you're using. And no matter who you use, you want the better deal. You want the lower rate. You want the best terms and so forth. And so if you use all these other principles that I discussed financially, it will allow you to understand which institution. And if you are stuck in an alternative mortgage, part of the objective here is to find ways to get out of that high cost product, if at all possible, and not have to pay, such money for time. And so I talked about the lenders and looking at 5 different lenders, and don't be married to any particular one. A lot of them are going to give you sales pitches, but ask questions and ask advocates and work with housing counselors and work with professionals that can allow you to understand maybe some things you don't understand, and at the same time help you maneuver through this complex financial system and be able to point you to the right product. So the main thing about a mortgage is always these 3 factors. Look at how much the rates are, the APR, the cost, rates, terms, and conditions. And I'll say this time and time again, because to do comparisons, they do have worksheets that you can use that actually show you exactly side by side what the rate comparisons are. So you can use that with any institution, the alternative institution, mainstream any institution, but you want to look at rates, terms, and conditions and know what the conditions are. What credit score do I need? What loan to value do I need? What debt ratio do I need? And so forth. Beware of scams, interest only, 80-20, subprime. Again, communities of color, immigrants, women, and vulnerable populations are always being scammed in some way, shape, or form. Beware bait and switch. As I talked about before, they tell you you're going to get one rate, and when you sit down to sign papers, they give you another. That was really preeminent during the foreclosure crisis, 2008, 2009, 2007. Many people lost their homes. And one tip I would always give you, never ever sign any documents that's shoved in your face. Take a minute, breathe, and read the material. I know you want to own your home sooner than later, and it's exciting. But it's what's not exciting is ending up with a tab you didn't ask for. And part of it is that's how sometimes we don't read in our haste. So again, just make sure you read the documents, read the contracts, understand the mortgage approval process in terms of being qualified. Pre-approval means that you have to sign a lot of documents. Pre-qualifications mean that you may be ready or you may not be ready. But also just check with your housing professionals if you're not understanding this. Work with your advocates, work with your housing counselors, credit counselors, financial counselors and the like. And so anytime you apply for a mortgage, you need standardized paperwork like bank statements, pay stubs, and the like. I can tell you during PPP in the pandemic, I worked for the Small Business Administration under the CARES Act, and part of the reason why some people didn't get loans, PPP loans, particularly the forgivable ones, was the fact they didn't have the documentation, they didn't have the tax returns, they didn't have the right documents for their small business. And so if there's anything that I could tell you is always have your paperwork together. Make sure you understand your bank statements and your pay stubs and so on and so forth. Okay. Stuck. Okay. And finally, as I close, you want to go and use the Freddie Mac single family building Black Wealth Campaign Toolkit. And in this toolkit is a lot of material that's going to be suitable for you to use. You can also go to Freddie Mac and look at the full listing of borrower help centers. And there's going to be some resources listed here that you can use as well. And summary to close, always know and set SMART goals. Identify your needs versus your want. Know what you can afford. Always do research, shop around, understand the cost versus benefit, and pinpoint the specific resources you need. Use advocates and counselors for that, and use refinancing as a wealth building tool and technique to save money and time on your mortgage and to improve your overall wealth and financial well-being. Thank you very much. Back to you, Linda.
Thank you, Mr. Wyndham. Okay, Sarah. Wait, let me take it away from Mr. Wyndham. Okay, Sarah, you have control. Is there help on the way for us?
I certainly hope so, but a lot of that depends on the work that you and me and everyone else on this line will do over the next month. I'm really excited to be with you today because we know that Congress is really contemplating a bill that would invest in affordable housing, especially for the lowest income renters, in a way that we haven't seen before. And if we could go 2 slides ahead. So I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the Build Back Better Act, which is a bill that is currently being negotiated by Congress. They've been working on this since March, so you may have heard the name Build Back Better before. There's been a lot of changes, but I want to talk to you about what is in the bill currently, what we stand to gain if Congress passes the bill, and likewise what we stand to lose if it doesn't happen. So overall, the Build Back Better Act is a $1.75 trillion economic recovery package that includes more than $150 billion in housing investments. As I mentioned before, this is a historic level of investment in affordable housing that we haven't seen in decades. And I just want to call out 3 of our top priorities in the bill that I think is going to go towards addressing some of the most severe housing needs in the nation. First, the bill includes $25 billion to expand rental assistance to 300,000 extremely low-income households, including people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. If enacted, this would be the largest increase in the rental assistance program in our nation's history, and would go a long way towards addressing the gap between what people earn and what their housing costs. The second piece that we're most excited about is $65 billion to preserve public housing. For decades, Congress has disinvested from public housing, leading to the demolition and disposition of 10,000 units at least a year. Congress has really neglected its role in keeping these properties in good condition and safe for residents. This bill goes a long ways to addressing the backlog of capital needs, which is somewhere around $70 billion right now. So it's a huge investment in public housing. And lastly, we're really excited to see $15 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund, which would help build or preserve homes affordable to people with the very lowest incomes. This program is currently funded at less than $1 billion each year, so it's a major investment in the program. And this is what we hope to be the major tool that the federal government uses going forward to build affordable housing, because it's so deeply targeted to people in need. What I think is really important here is that those 3 items are the 3 largest line items in the entire bill on housing, and they count for about 2/3 of the overall housing allocation, which really shows that advocates, members of Congress, or champions are very much aligned in making sure that when we're having major investments, we're serving people who have the greatest needs. I have a link to a fact sheet that you guys can use for more information, but I'll provide a brief overview of some other pieces if we go to the next slide. So beyond those 3 top priorities that we have, there are lots of other resources that are in the bill. That includes an expansion of the low-income housing tax credit, the home program, rural housing program, capital magnet program, the list goes on. Lots of programs that are aimed at trying to increase the supply of affordable homes, and programs that help local communities address zoning barriers that might restrict the private market building of supply. Other resources in the bill are really aimed at improving existing affordable housing, meaning addressing health and safety concerns, removing lead hazards, improving resiliency and energy efficiency. There's more resources for fair housing, which we know are incredibly important to make sure that these resources are being deployed in a way that furthers fair housing. And finally, there's a new program that aims to close the racial wealth gap by providing down payment assistance to first-generation homeowners. Notice I said first-generation homeowners and not just first-time homeowners. That provision of the bill is really drafted in a way to try to get at the racial wealth gap by helping those households that don't have other resources and their families to help with down payment. Next slide. This is just a new program that I think is really interesting and that there'll be a lot of focus on going forward, but it hasn't gotten a ton of attention. So just to flag it for you, that there's a new program called the Community Restoration and Revitalization Act that is in the bill, and it's really geared at I guess it's not geared towards building the capacity of community-based organizations, but the money goes to those organizations that have a demonstrated commitment to anti-displacement efforts. This is really the first time we're seeing the federal government provide resources specifically to combat gentrification. And I think it's going to be a potentially really important resource for building BIPOC-led organizations on the ground doing grassroots work. Next slide. So where do things go from here? Well, we had finally had a vote in the House earlier in November where the bill passed, but Now we face the challenge that we've been facing for the last 9 months, which is how can we get it through in the Senate? Democrats are using a process called budget reconciliation that allows them to pass a bill with just 50 votes in the Senate rather than the typical 60 votes. But that still means that they're going to need the support of every single Senate Democrat to get this across the finish line. And we still haven't gotten anything public from Senator's Manchin or Sinema about their willingness to vote for the bill. There's still a lot of negotiations going on, not really about the housing provisions of the bill, but of other pieces of the bill. And so we are still in need of putting a lot of pressure on members of Congress to make sure that this gets across the finish line. Because we expect there to be changes on the Senate side, the bill is going to have to go back to the House for a second vote. And just in case you were asking about that, we can only lose 3 Democrats on the House side. So again, this is a bill that needs nearly unanimous support among Democrats in the House and Senate. So there's a lot of work for advocates to be doing right now to make sure that we can get this across the finish line. Of course, if the bill passes, when the bill passes, there's going to be an enormous amount of work to make sure that these resources are being deployed equitably and quickly in our communities. I know that we'll be turning our attention in the spring of 2020 towards implementation, but I just want to flag that for folks that could be a place where all of you have an impact on making sure that resources are reaching your communities in the way that you hope. And so with that, I just want to encourage folks to use this next month to be engaged with their members of Congress, to be talking to them about why these affordable housing investments are so important and why they need to pass the Build Back Better Act. And I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. Oh, wow. Nelson, I know we have a ton of questions. A special thanks to all of the speakers for your amazing presentations. Now, if you could just hang in there with us for just a little while longer, I'm sure we have a lot of questions. Nelson, do we have questions for the guest speakers?
Yes, let's get a few questions in. I know we're over time, but earlier somebody, our first speaker, Tara, talked about how there are hurdles to issuing small mortgages. And somebody is asking, does the federal government have any kind of answers to this, or are they addressing this in any way?
Hi, thanks for that question. So there are a lot of policy focused movement right now, both inside and outside of government. Some of the things that we're watching to see if there will be an impact on small mortgages, whether that's good or bad, are things like the CFPB's seasoned QM rule, which was put into effect this year, and we'll have data on that in a few years. Also through the duty to serve regulations from Fannie and Freddie, because manufactured homes are lower cost, those mortgages are naturally smaller. And the goal of the duty to serve regulations includes expanding liquidity for those markets and focusing on underserved areas such as manufactured homes, rural housing, so on and so forth. And so, yes, there is some movement there. There are a few other policies moving as well. And I know that the Federal Reserve has also been exploring challenges that institutions are facing to originating small mortgages. So great question. Yep, there does seem to be a lot of increased attention to this.
Great, thank you. And then somebody's asking, I guess, for clarification, are land contracts similar to land trusts? If any.
Yeah, it's Tara. I can jump in, and others might have more details on this. They're not. They're different. I have, not in front of me. I do have. I can follow up offline. I have kind of definitions that, because we've talked about this before, that further explain differences there. But no, they're not the same thing. Yeah, if that person wants to contact me offline, I'm happy to have more of an in-depth conversation. I think Sarah might have dropped off already, but she would also be quite familiar, I think, with differences here.
Great, and your contact information is in the slides that everyone will get hopefully by tomorrow. So
it is, yeah, and we're not studying land trusts. We're only looking at land contracts, land installment sales, because we're specifically focused on housing that is sold with land contracts.
Okay, well, great. They can reach out to you. Next question is, are there special requirements for seller financed land contracts, such as licensure?
So it's Tara, I can jump in again unless others wanted to answer. So as I mentioned in the presentation, about half of states have some kind of substantive law here on land contracts. I believe about a dozen have requirements to record. I don't think there's any licensure requirements. Sarah mentioned in her presentation that there is a certain threshold at which these credit falls under TILA requirements at the federal level. And so there are certain thresholds once you start talking about credit. If someone like a corporation is doing a lot of these, and then you do get into licensure discussions depending on the state and what the laws are that govern that. But by and large, just talking about land contracts, if I wanted to do, and I don't need a license to do that, these often fall under contract law instead, especially if it's with individual sellers. But that's a great question and something we should explore further. But to my knowledge, that's not really applicable.
Thank you, Tara. Somebody's asking whether maybe anyone on the panel has heard of something called Imagine Home Ownership, and whether that's something they can trust. And if you haven't, then that's fine. Imagine Home Ownership. If not, then we can, whoever asked that can send us another question, send Linda or me more information, and we can try to reach out to the panelists later. Another comment was that it was mentioned about the need for affordable housing, and the comment simply that accessible units are needed, not just affordable. Does anybody know about any work around that?
I'm happy to jump in and have other folks join in too. Yeah, I'm so glad this was raised. Accessibility is a huge issue. We know that a very, very small percentage of the supply that's out there is accessible to people with disabilities, and that despite federal dollars going into the supply, not enough of those units are built to be accessible either. So it's a major issue, and one of the reasons that contributes to homelessness, because there's people experiencing homelessness are much more likely to be experiencing a disability than the general population. So I thank people for raising that. It's something that we hope to have more reforms on going forward. The Build Back Better Act is sort of restricted in what Congress can do because they're using budget reconciliation. There's not enough of an opportunity to make reforms to existing HUD programs, but we're hoping to take up legislation in the coming year on that.
That's excellent. And that was Sarah Sadian, right?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So folks can also reach out to her for more on that, or maybe we'll have something to share. If you have something for us to share with our attendees later, let us know. And Linda, I'll turn it back over to you in the interest of time.
Great, Nelson. Thank you. And a special thanks again to our speakers for hanging in there and answering the questions. You've been awesome. Again, this webinar is presented as part of Consumer Action's COVID-19 educational project with funding from AT&T, and you can find all the materials on our COVID page at the website listed below. If you're interested in contributing to Consumer Action, if you enjoyed the webinar and if you enjoyed it as much as you enjoy a double latte, well, hold up on the latte and write us a check for the amount of that latte and send it to Consumer Action at Attention Membership Giving at 57 Post Street, Suite 611, San Francisco, California. If you enjoyed it as much as a T-bone steak dinner, get a hamburger and write us out the check for the cost of that T-bone steak dinner. We appreciate it. Another way that you can help us is by subscribing to our YouTube channel. As I stated earlier in the webinar has been recorded. You receive a link no later than tomorrow afternoon. When you receive that link, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's free, and it would help us continue to bring you these great webinars. Again, a special thanks to our amazing speakers. Please join me in sending them the love for those great informative presentations. We appreciate them taking time out of their busy professional schedule to be here. And to you, our fantastic audience, thanks again for joining us. I noticed some of you haven't registered for our credit reporting scores webinar that's scheduled for Tuesday, December the 7th. We have a couple of slots. Hit me up and on the email, and I will make sure you get a VIP invite. In the meantime, I look forward to welcoming you back on December the 7th. In the interim, stay safe and please enjoy the rest of your day. Mwah! Thank you. Bye.